entire card tonight in one take. Very, very hot Saturday night here, hence the vest. And yeah, it was getting a bit of a heated in the arena in Wales, certainly towards the main event with Liam Williams vs Gary Corcoran. Let me say, and I'll come to this in more detail throughout the course of this video, probably not a night of boxing to remember on the whole, and a night of boxing that was probably saved in many ways by a main event that finally caught light. Liam Williams vs Gary Corcoran, it was a messy fight, it was a scrappy fight, it was quite a rough, dirty fight, but at the same time, it was an entertaining, edge of your seat style scrap. I had Liam Williams a long, long way ahead. As you guys will know, he won the fight by stoppage in the 11th round. And there was some suggestions with some of the commentary and the like that, you know, Gary Corcoran was coming on strong and, you know, the fight was getting a bit tighter. I didn't see it this way. I think out of the 11 rounds, I know there was only 10 completed rounds, but out of the 10 completed rounds, I only scored 2 in favour of Gary Corcoran, and the rest I had in favour of Liam Williams. I thought Liam Williams appeared to land the better educated boxing in there. I also thought clearly his punches were harder and he had the ability to hurt his opponent more. You know, in terms of the fight itself, first round, Gary Corcoran comes out. He's actually boxing quite smartly. I was scoring the first round in favour of Corcoran till the very last 30 seconds when William hits him and hits him hard. And I actually think, and I need to watch it again, I've only seen it once, I actually think the punch Williams lands on Corcoran at the end of the first round should very well have been called a knockdown. You know, I think Terry O'Connell, who I don't think had the best night tonight anyway, possibly should have called that fight a knockdown. I thought Corcoran had completely lost his footing, and as far as I'm concerned, if someone goes down and is near horizontal, his body was like that angle, and he's saved only by the ropes, you know, that's a knockdown. And I think that's the rule. You know, maybe I'm wrong here. Somebody comment below. Somebody will know the rules better than I do. I thought if it was a definite knockdown, only saved by the ropes, then it stands as a knockdown. And you see the referee, Terry O'Connell, coming in and putting himself between the two men. So Williams takes a step back. You know, had Terry not done that and had Williams been allowed to carry on his boxing, I think he'd have dropped him anyway. That second or two gave Corcoran time to get out of that position and recover. So I think Williams probably did score a knockdown in the first round, but as I say, I need to watch it again. So leave your comments below and let me know if I'm right or wrong there. I may well be wrong. You know, I scored the first couple of rounds wholly to Liam Williams. I thought Corcoran really got sucked in, and got wound up and really sort of negated his boxing and got too much involved in the scrap, basically. He did start coming into it. I think I've scored him the 8th round and the 9th round. He got a sort of unlucky points deduction in the 9th round. But those were the 2 rounds where it looked like he was starting to gain a foothold in the fight. Williams, there was some suggestion he was getting worn down. There was some suggestion he was starting to gas. But he came on strongly for me. Got his second win in 10th and 11th and was able to get the stoppage of Corcoran. And I know his corner may have been complaining. As far as I'm concerned, that was a good stoppage. The right time to step in. One thing I will say, I'm sure when the lights came on, because there was brawling in the crowd, Frank Warren was slightly annoyed because the amount of empty seats in that arena became visible. And that was not visible until those lights came up due to the fight in the crowd. But there were a huge amount of empty seats in that arena, certainly to my eye. Again, let me know if I'm wrong. Maybe you saw it better than I did. But, you know, when those lights came on, I saw rows of empty seats, which for me is a bit disappointing. Obviously, it's hard to promote these fights without the platform of Sky and, you know, all of that stuff. But you'd think a bill like this with 2 world title fights and with a big domestic scrap would sell more tickets. So there you go. On the undercard, now as I say, the Williams-Corcoran fight was a good fight. You know, that was a an entertaining fight. Even though it was a bit of a clumsy, scrappy affair, it was an entertaining fight that kept you on the edge of your seat. And certainly there's talk of a rematch there. I'd watch a rematch. Whether people will be picking Corcoran to win a rematch, I don't know. Liam Williams said after the fight, it was one of my worst performances and I stopped him. Why do I need to give him a rematch? There's the suggestion that Liam Williams could perhaps go on to bigger, better things after that fight, and I could understand if he does want to move in that direction. Nevertheless, I think a rematch would be an interesting scrap. It was an entertaining fight. But before this fight, the card itself, I've got to say, was a bit of a disappointment. Rigondeaux versus Dickens, a slightly bizarre fight. The first 2 rounds were very competitive. You probably would edge towards Rigondeaux in both rounds, but hard to say he was dominant. He landed an absolute peach, one of the nicest punches you'll ever see in the second round. But it was a single punch, and to be fair to him, Dickens took it very well. And Dickens was in the fight. It was competitive. It was a competitive matchup, and it was a weird fight. It was low volume. They were very much waiting to pick the shots, and I guess that's one of the criticisms of Rigondeaux is if the chance doesn't arise for him to counterpunch, he just won't throw. He becomes very low output, and I guess that's what was evident in the first 2 rounds. And, they sat down after the second round, and I was thinking, is Dickens in this fight? And then suddenly the referee's waving it off, and apparently it's because that absolute piece of a right hand Rigondeaux's landed has broken Dickens' jaw. So, fair play to the corner for calling it off. If his jaw's broken, and I guess you've got to save him for another day. But a disappointment that the fight ended in that fashion before the fight had really begun in earnest. And speaking of disappointments, the Terry Flanagan versus Rigondeaux Fana, I'm sure I pronounced that wrongly, but I gave it my best attempt. That was a really poor fight to watch. Fana, he's a very awkward, slippery, unorthodox opponent. Very hard to hit clean, very hard to look good against. And I think that's one of the problems. Someone put on Twitter, if you bring in a 56-year-old opponent who's and your man is 1 to 100 on to beat him, and he looks that flat, you've got to expect criticism. And I think that's fair. As I said when I was discussing the fight on the podcast the other day, Fana looked very old to me. I know he's only 42, but to me he looked like much, much older than that. And he looked absolutely tiny in there. Tiny. It's hard to say he looked a weight class below Terry Flanagan, because the gap in size looked even bigger than that to me. And you basically had Flanagan fighting a midget who was twice his age, and the guy was, Fana was very experienced, very awkward, very slippery. It made for a terrible fight that didn't really show the best of Terry Flanagan. Flanagan seemed to be struggling with finding his range. Flanagan seemed to be smothering his own work. He seemed to be incapable of getting clean, crisp combinations off. And although he hurt Fana several times, I think he dropped him in the 4th and he dropped him in the 12th, really, it wasn't a vintage Flanagan performance. It was one of the lesser performances that we've seen from him, especially with the recent streak of form he's been in. We saw him eating a few punches off Fana. We saw Fana able to land a jab on several occasions. And all in all, it's slightly disappointing. And given the low level of opposition that Flanagan was facing, you'd have liked to have seen him do a more convincing job. But as the old phrase goes, styles make fights, and Fana was very, very negative. Fana was backing off on the back foot, trying to avoid conflict, and that probably didn't play into Flanagan's usual hands. You see Flanagan as a guy who times fighters, who counterpunches fighters, and he didn't have the luxury of doing that tonight. So, yeah, I guess all in all, if you look at the top of the bill, Williams versus Corcoran, a good fight but a messy fight, probably, as Williams has admitted, the worst performance of his career. Flanagan versus Fana, a real frustrating fight that really never caught fire. Rigo versus Jazza, over before it had and a sort of very disappointing conclusion. So, top of the bill, left the bit to be desired, really. If we move very swiftly to the undercard, Tommy Langford got a win, mid-round stoppage over Timo Laine. I've probably pronounced that wrong, but there you go. Langford looked relatively good, but the opponent was absolutely woeful. You know, the opponent offered very, very, very little indeed. Langford, not the biggest puncher in the world, ground him down, wore him down, and eventually was able to score the stoppage. You know, Langford looked good in there. He was a class above the opponent. The opponent was very, very, very uninspiring, I'm afraid. Bradley Skeet versus Alex Lepelle. You know, Bradley Skeet is... I'd be frustrated if I was him. I'd be frustrated why I'm fighting on this bill. You know, he's a guy who really needs a push for me. Now, I know there's talks about him potentially fighting for a world title in the future. Let's see if that gets made. I hope it does, because Bradley Skeet is a real nice guy, and he's a real talent in there. You know, he is... some of the stuff he's doing in there, some of the defensive stuff, some of the footwork, some of the jab is, you know, real grade A. And he won every round against Alex Lepelle with considerable ease. But this opponent, you know, he was terrible, which was a theme throughout the undercard, I'm afraid. He looked absolutely tiny, and similar to Flanagan Fana, Lepelle didn't just look one weight class below Bradley Skeet. He looked multiple weight classes below Bradley Skeet. You know, and I think I overheard Bradley Skeet's corner, his trainer saying to him, "You're making this look too much like a spar. You know, push the pace a bit more." And I guess that's the one criticism of Bradley Skeet is you know, he's looking beautiful in there, how he's, you know, defending up against the ropes, then pivoting, wheeling off and landing the jab, and, you know, landing some crisp punches. But he doesn't tend to go through the gears. He doesn't look to force the pace. He doesn't look for the stoppage. He's happy just to drift along. And, you know, that's cost him a few times in the past. Cost him in the Frankie Gavin fight, which for me was a fight he could very easily have won. You know, but he allowed the fight to just sort of drift ever so slightly for me. So, you know, he did score the stoppage, Bradley Skeet. Slightly controversial circumstances. Looked like he'd landed a big low blow on Lepelle and was then able to force him out of there. You know, I'm unclear whether that stoppage would have occurred without the low blow. But, you know, nevertheless, Skeet goes marching on. Need to see him in a proper fight soon. This is a guy who deserves a push. Let's hope the talk about him getting a world title isn't nonsense. Let's hope that actually happens. Just moving very very briefly to some of the lesser undercard fights. Joe Pigford versus Sam Amidi. Pigford wins by stoppage. Pigford, we know he's a big puncher. Very very wild in there. Very very little defence indeed. You've got to question how he'll do stepping up in class. He keeps his hands so low. He keeps his head straight up in the air, and he's so open to being timed when he's punching. Yeah, the opponent he was in tonight was had 7 fights, and he'd only won 4 of them, and he was landing on Pigford heavily. You know, Pigford, he is a hard puncher, but when he hits you, he overcommits massively and comes wading in with his chin literally straight up in the air. So, you know, he's potentially an interesting talent, but you've got to wonder when he steps up to title level whether that lack of defence is going to find him out, and I suspect it may do, if I'm honest. The crowd singing Joy Division's "Love Will Tear Us Apart" to the phrase "Pig will tear you apart" has got to be a particular highlight of that match for me. I remember last time he fought, the MC said it's time to release the pig, so I love the swine-related banter associated with Pigford's surname, but there you go. Maybe he needs to stop coming up with puns and start some head movement and keeping his hands up when he's throwing. Jamie Conlon beating an opponent with a losing record in 2 rounds, learnt nothing from that. I guess it keeps him busy, but, you know, pretty uninspiring, pointless fight. And then Alex Hughes beat Alistair Warren. Don't have too much time to go through that in detail. Good learning fight for Hughes. He goes to 8-0 with this win. Again, a bit defensively open. His hands quite low, and it was quite scrappy. You know, Hughes negated his boxing and allowed his work to be smothered, allowed the fight to be up a bit too close. So perhaps I'm being critical, but uninspiring performances from the likes of Hughes, Pigford and Conlon. Skeet and Langford took care of business. Let's see them step up in class. Underwhelming top of the bill. Corcoran and Williams saved it. good but sloppy fight. Let me know your thoughts, guys. If you've enjoyed this, hit the thumbs up button. If you're new to the channel, please do subscribe.